On a freezing Christmas event, a Hell's Angel biker sat silently at a bus stop when he noticed an elderly couple huddled beside him, shaking, abandoned, and barely holding on to each other. Everyone else walked past, but the biker didn't. And then suddenly, this story will surprise you. Before I continue, let me know in the comments. Have you subscribed to the channel or not? And also tell me which city and country you are watching from, so that I can thank you personally. Christmas event had arrived wrapped in bitter cold. Light snow drifted steadily from the gray sky, settling on bare branches and frozen sidewalks. The bus stop glowed softly with Christmas decorations, red bows tied to the metal frame, warm yellow lights hanging behind glass panels, and a small decorated tree standing nearby. It looked festive from a distance, but the cold stripped away any sense of comfort. On the wooden bench beneath the shelter sat 3 people. At one end was an elderly man and woman, pressed close together as if their bodies were the only warmth left in the world. The man wore a simple knit cap and a dark, worn coat, but the coat wasn't on him. He had wrapped it around the woman's shoulders instead. Beneath it, he sat in nothing more than a thick sweater, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles pale from the cold. The woman leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. A heavy shawl covered her, yet her hands still trembled. Wisps of white hair slipped loose around her face. Her cheeks were streaked with tears that had frozen before they could fall. She didn't speak. She barely moved, but her breathing was shallow, uneven. On the other end of the bench sat a third figure, a Hell's Angel biker. He was broad-shouldered, with long hair and a thick beard dusted lightly with snow. A sleeveless leather vest clung to his frame, patches stitched across the chest and back. His arms were covered in dark tattoos, his jeans torn at the knees. To anyone passing by, he looked intimidating, out of place among Christmas lights and holiday cheer. He sat still, staring straight ahead. But he wasn't unaware. He noticed the way the old man kept adjusting the coat around the woman, even though his own shoulders shook from the cold. He noticed how the woman's fingers barely curled around the edge of the shawl. He noticed the 2 small suitcases resting at their feet, old, scuffed, and packed with everything they owned. Buses came and went. Doors opened. People stepped out, bundled in warm coats, laughing, talking, rushing home to families and heated houses. Some glanced at the bench. Most didn't. The biker finally shifted, breaking the silence. "You've been here a while," he said, his voice low and rough, not unkind. The elderly man stiffened. He turned slowly, eyes sharp with instinctive caution. "We're fine," he said quickly. "Just waiting." The biker didn't argue. He simply nodded slightly and looked at the woman. "Waiting for who?" "Our son," the woman answered softly. Her voice shook. "He said he'd come." The biker glanced toward the bus schedule posted on the glass wall, then at his watch. "What time did your bus arrive?" The man hesitated, then answered quietly. 5:30 this morning." The biker's jaw tightened. That meant more than 6 hours. 6 hours sitting in freezing temperatures on Christmas Eve. "He's late," the biker said calmly. "Not late," the man replied, eyes lowering. "Just not here yet." The woman lifted her head slightly, confusion clouding her face. "He promised," she whispered. "He said he'd take care of us." The biker didn't respond right away. Promises were things he'd learned not to trust. He watched the snow collect on the woman's shawl, watched her body sag further into the man beside her. The wind picked up, slicing through the bus stop. The biker stood. He rolled his shoulders, then stepped in front of the bench. "You can't stay out here," he said. "It's dangerous." "We can't leave," the woman said urgently. "If he comes and we're gone." "He's not coming," the man said quietly. The words seemed to cost him something. His voice cracked as he spoke, and he looked away, staring at the frozen pavement. The biker watched the moment unfold. He saw years of loyalty collapse in a single sentence. He saw a man who had protected someone his entire life finally admit the truth. The woman shook her head. "No, he wouldn't do that. He's our son." Snow continued to fall. The biker exhaled slowly. He reached up and tugged at the edge of his vest, then looked down at the man's bare hands, blue at the fingertips. "You gave him everything," the biker said quietly. It wasn't a question. The man didn't deny it. The biker took a step closer. "Listen to me," he said. "You're not spending Christmas event on this bench." "We don't want to be a burden," the man said, pride flaring even now. "You're not," the biker replied firmly, "and this isn't a negotiation." The woman looked up at him, eyes wide with uncertainty. "You don't even know us." The biker nodded. "That's true." He paused, then added, "But I know what abandonment looks like." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the biker reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't dial yet. He looked at the couple one last time. "Stand up slowly," he said. "Both of you." The man hesitated, but then, carefully, he rose, helping the woman to her feet. As snow fell harder and Christmas lights flickered behind them, a line had been crossed, and none of their lives would be the same again. The elderly man rose slowly from the bench, his joints stiff as if the cold had locked them in place. He held tightly to his wife, guiding her up with careful hands. Dorothy swayed the moment she stood, her knees buckling under her own weight. Before she could fall, the Hell's Angel biker stepped forward and placed a firm hand beneath her arm. "Easy," he said, steady and calm. "I've got you." Dorothy looked up at him, startled. Under different circumstances, his appearance might have frightened her. Long hair, heavy beard, tattoos crawling up his arms. But in that moment, his voice carried certainty, strength. She leaned into him without another word. Snow was falling harder now, swirling around the bus stop. The Christmas lights flickered behind them, glowing faintly through the white blur, as if even the decorations were losing their fight against the cold. "Where would we even go?" the old man asked quietly. There was no argument in his tone, just exhaustion. "Somewhere warm," the biker replied. "That's the first thing that matters." The man hesitated. "We don't have much money." "Not a concern right now," the biker cut in, without harshness. "One step at a time." He reached down and lifted both suitcases before the man could protest. They were heavier than they looked, decades of life packed into 2 battered bags. The biker didn't comment. He simply carried them. They crossed the parking lot, boots crunching against frozen snow. Parked nearby was an old pickup truck, its paint faded but sturdy, the kind of vehicle built to last. The biker opened the passenger door and helped Dorothy inside, then turned the heater on full blast. Warm air flooded the cab. Dorothy gasped softly. "It's warm." The man climbed into the seat beside her, watching closely as color slowly returned to her face. For the first time in hours, his shoulders lowered just a little. The truck pulled onto the road. For several minutes, no one spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the soft hiss of the heater battling the cold. Finally, the man cleared his throat. "My name is Harold," he said. "This is my wife, Dorothy." The biker nodded once, eyes still on the road. "All right. And you?" Harold asked. The biker paused for a moment before answering. People call me Hank. Harold didn't ask questions. Some names, he sensed, carried entire histories behind them. A small diner came into view ahead, its neon sign buzzing weakly against the night. Hank pulled into the parking lot and parked close to the entrance. Inside, warmth wrapped around them instantly. The smell of coffee, soup, and grilled food filled the air. A few families sat in booths, talking quietly, unaware of the small rescue that had just taken place outside. Hank guided them to a booth and motioned for them to sit. Dorothy lowered herself onto the bench, visibly relieved. Hank shrugged off his vest and draped it over her shoulders, even though his own arms were bare. The waitress approached, her eyes flicking briefly over the couple before settling on Hank. "What can I get you?" "Hot coffee," Hank said. "Soup, whatever's fastest, 3 of everything." The waitress nodded and hurried off. Dorothy clasped her hands together, trying to stop them from shaking. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "You don't even know us." Hank looked at her for a long moment. "I know enough," he said. "I know what it looks like when someone's been left behind." Harold swallowed hard. "Our son said he'd take care of us," he began. His voice was steady, but something inside him cracked as he spoke. "He sold our house, the one we lived in for over 50 years, said we'd move in with him, that everything would be fine." Dorothy stared down at the table. "I packed Christmas presents," she whispered, "for the grandchildren." Harold nodded. "Then this morning he called, said we were too much, that we needed to figure things out ourselves." Hank's jaw tightened. His fingers curled slowly around his coffee mug as it arrived, knuckles whitening. "On Christmas Eve," he said quietly. Harold nodded. "On Christmas Eve." The soup arrived, steam rising in thick clouds. Dorothy took the first spoonful, and her shoulders began to shake. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not frozen this time. Real tears. Warm tears. "I thought we did something wrong," she whispered. "I thought maybe I forgot something. Maybe I made him angry." Hank shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "You didn't do anything wrong." Harold looked at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Hank leaned back slightly. "Some people forget where they came from," he said. "That doesn't make it your fault." The couple ate slowly, carefully, like people relearning how to feel safe. With every bite, the color returned to their faces. With every sip of coffee, the cold loosened its grip. Hank watched them quietly, something heavy settling in his chest. This wasn't just about a warm meal. He knew that now. When they finished, he set his cup down. "You're not going back to that bench tonight," he said. Harold looked up, startled. "We don't want to trouble you." "You're not," Hank said again. "And I mean it." Snow continued to fall outside the diner windows, and in that moment, Hank made a decision that would reach far beyond one cold night, one that would change all of their lives. Snow continued to fall outside the diner windows. The neon lights reflected off the white ground, blurring softly, as if time itself had slowed. Inside, Harold and Dorothy sat quietly, their bodies warmed by soup and coffee, but their hearts still heavy with fear and shame. Hank paid the bill and rose from the booth. "Let's go," he said simply. Harold looked up, startled. "Go where?" Hank glanced toward the window, then back at them. "Somewhere you'll be safe tonight." Dorothy tightened her grip around her cup. "We don't want to be a burden," she said softly. "We've taken care of ourselves our whole lives." Hank met her eyes. There was no harshness in his gaze, only truth. "Sometimes taking care of yourself doesn't mean doing everything alone," he said. "Sometimes stopping is strength, too." Harold drew a deep breath. Years of pride wrestled inside him, but exhaustion spoke louder. Finally, he nodded. They climbed back into the truck, and Hank turned the heater up again. Dorothy pulled the thick shawl closer to her chest. The streets were nearly empty, Christmas Eve having pulled families indoors, behind warm doors and locked windows. After a few minutes, Harold broke the silence. "We should have gone to a shelter," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "People say there's help there." Hank tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Some shelters are good," he replied. "Some aren't, and tonight, most of them are full." Dorothy spoke quietly. "So where are we going?" Hank hesitated before answering. "I have a place," he said at last. "Nothing fancy, just a small house. It's warm. It's safe." Silence filled the cab. Harold turned to look at him. "You're taking us to your home?" Hank nodded. "Just for tonight. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." Tears welled in Dorothy's eyes. "We're strangers," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't even know us." Hank replied softly, "I used to be a stranger to someone once too." He didn't explain further, but the weight behind the words said enough. A few minutes later, the truck pulled up in front of a modest wooden house. Snow covered the small front yard. A single porch light glowed above the door. Old, dim, but steady. It wasn't grand. It wasn't impressive. But in the middle of the cold night, it looked like shelter. Hank stepped out first, clearing a path through the snow. He helped Harold and Dorothy carefully toward the door. The moment it opened, warm air and the faint smell of coffee filled the space. Dorothy took one step inside and froze. "It's lovely," she whispered, as if afraid the word might break the moment. Hank guided them to the couch and wrapped blankets around their shoulders. "Sit," he said. "I'll get you some water." Harold glanced around the room. The walls were plain, decorated with a few old photographs. One showed a younger Hank beside a motorcycle, his arm around a young woman. The picture looked old, faded by time and loss. Harold wanted to ask, but stayed silent. Dorothy reached out from beneath the blanket and gently held Hank's hand. "Why are you saving us?" she asked quietly. Hank paused. Then he answered honestly. "Because if I had kept walking, I wouldn't be able to look at myself tomorrow." Dorothy's tears fell freely now. Not from fear, but gratitude. "Our son never gave us this," Harold said in a low voice. "Not even once." Hank looked down. "Blood doesn't always make a family," he said, "and family isn't always blood." That night they stayed awake longer than they expected. Harold spoke of his life, building houses with his own hands, raising a child he once believed would stand by him forever, and slowly losing everything he trusted. Dorothy smiled at some memories, drifted at others, pausing when her mind couldn't quite keep up. And Hank listened. For the first time in a long while, he didn't run. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He simply stayed. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the small house, the cold had finally lost its grip. And Hank knew this wasn't just a place to sleep for one night. It was a responsibility, one he could no longer walk away from. The house had grown quiet. Only the soft ticking of the clock marked the passing of time. Outside, snow continued to fall, but without sound, as if even the cold had chosen to respect the fragile peace inside the small home. Dorothy lay stretched out on the couch, wrapped tightly in blankets. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing steadier than it had been all day. Harold sat beside her on a chair, holding her hand with both of his, afraid that if he let go, everything might fall apart again. Hank stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching them. Silence like this was unfamiliar to him. His life had always been filled with noise, the roar of engines, the rush of highways, the constant movement of the road. Tonight, the stillness pressed in on him, heavy and unsettling. He stepped into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee, but before taking a sip, he stopped. His eyes drifted to the small dining table where 2 old suitcases rested. The same suitcases that had sat at Harold and Dorothy's feet on the frozen bus stop bench. Hank crouched beside one of them. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. Just resting his hand on the worn surface told him, enough. This wasn't luggage. It was a lifetime, compressed, reduced, carried away. He stood and moved to the window. Outside, the world was blanketed in white. Christmas Eve. A night people associated with warmth, family, laughter. And yet 2 elderly souls had nearly spent it abandoned in the cold. We must have failed somewhere. Harold's voice broke the silence. Hank turned. Harold was looking at him now, his eyes filled with doubt and self-blame. We gave him everything, Harold said quietly. Time, work, love. We never held back. And still, why? Hank pulled out a chair and sat across from him. Sometimes, he said slowly, the problem isn't what you gave. It's what the other person was capable of receiving. Harold lowered his gaze. He's our son, he said, his voice cracking. Even now, I'm afraid to blame him. Hank nodded. Some truths are hardest to face when blood is involved. Dorothy shifted in her sleep, murmuring softly. Kevin. Harold leaned forward instantly. I'm here, Dot, he whispered. You're safe. Watching them, something tightened in Hank's chest. This wasn't just a married couple. This was a bond built over decades, a promise renewed every single day, through sickness, struggle, and loss. Hank looked away. You're safe tonight, he said quietly. But tomorrow won't be easy. Harold nodded slowly. I know. Then, after gathering his courage, he asked, should we talk to the police, or some kind of authority? Hank didn't hesitate. Yes, he said plainly. What happened to you isn't just cruelty, it's abuse. Fear flickered across Harold's face. I don't know if I can stand against my own son. This isn't about going against him, Hank interrupted gently. It's about standing up for yourselves. Silence filled the room again. Hank rose, adjusted the blanket around Dorothy's shoulders, and paused beside her. Get some rest, he said softly. We'll talk in the morning. I'm not going anywhere. Harold looked up at him. Why are you doing all this for us? He asked again. You barely know us. Hank reached for the light switch, dimming the room. Because once, he said quietly, I was alone too, and if no one had stopped for me, I wouldn't be standing here today. He turned away and walked toward the chair near the wall. The night deepened. Dorothy finally slept peacefully. Harold's tears slipped free, silent tears of gratitude mixed with grief, and Hank stayed awake. For the first time in years, he realized that Christmas wasn't just a date on the calendar. It was the moment a person chose who they wanted to be. And Hank knew. There was no turning back now. The first light of morning crept across the snow, spilling pale brightness into the small living room. Outside, the world lay silent and white, as if the night had left behind a witness to everything that had happened. Hank had dozed in the chair, boots still on, but the faint creak of the house settling pulled him awake. The clock read 7. Dorothy was still asleep, wrapped tightly in blankets. Her face looked calmer now, less strained. Harold, however, was wide awake. He sat at the edge of the couch, staring out the window as if he were bracing himself for something he couldn't yet see. Morning's here, Hank said quietly. Harold nodded. And with it, a strange feeling, like something's coming. Hank moved into the kitchen and brewed coffee. The smell filled the room, but it brought little comfort. He set 3 mugs on the counter, one for Harold, one for himself, and one for Dorothy when she woke. Today we face reality, Hank said. Some decisions can't wait anymore. Harold wrapped his hands around the warm mug but didn't drink. His voice dropped. Do you think my son might come here? Hank didn't look away. Men like him don't like losing control. If he thinks he's losing it, he'll show up. Harold's grip tightened. The knock came without warning, hard, sharp, demanding. Hank straightened instantly. Years on the road had taught him when trouble was at the door. He motioned for Harold to stay seated and walked calmly toward the entrance. The knock came again, louder this time. Hank opened the door. A well-dressed man stood outside, wearing an expensive coat that looked out of place in the falling snow. His hair was perfectly styled, his expression sharp with confidence. Behind him stood a woman, silent, her posture tense. I'm here for my parents, the man said coldly. My name is Kevin. Hank didn't step aside. You've got the wrong idea, he said evenly. No one's being held here. Kevin's eyes narrowed. My mother isn't well. She gets confused, easily influenced. I'm taking them home. From inside, Harold's voice carried, weak but steady. Kevin, enough. Kevin froze. He leaned forward, peering past Hank, and saw his father standing there. For a moment, surprise crossed his face, then irritation. Dad, Kevin said, stepping inside. We need to leave. These people are strangers. Harold stood up fully now. His back wasn't straight, but his voice was. You left us at a bus station, he said, in 19-degree weather, on Christmas Eve. Kevin looked away. I told you I couldn't handle it anymore. And that was your solution? Harold's voice rose. To abandon us? Dorothy had woken. She stood near the hallway, clutching her blanket. Kevin, you said you'd come back for us, she whispered. Kevin softened his tone instantly. Smooth, practiced. Mom, you're confused. Let's go home. I'll take care of everything. Hank stepped forward. That's not your call, he said. They decide. Kevin turned sharply. Who do you think you are? Hank met his gaze. I'm the man who didn't leave them to freeze. The room fell silent. Harold took a deep breath. We're staying here by choice, he said. And we're speaking to authorities. Kevin's face flushed. You don't understand what you're doing. We understand perfectly, Harold replied, and we're done being quiet. Hank felt it then. The line had been crossed. This was no longer a family argument. It was a reckoning. And it had only just begun. The silence after Harold's words felt heavier than the winter air outside. Kevin stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his jaw tight, his confidence visibly shaken. For the first time since he'd arrived, he seemed unsure which move to make next. Dorothy clutched her blanket closer around her shoulders. Her eyes moved between her son and her husband, confusion mixing with a fragile clarity that surfaced in rare moments. You left us, she said softly. At the bus station, I remember the cold. Kevin turned toward her quickly. Mom, please, you're not remembering things right. You were tired. Upset. No, she said, her voice trembling but firm. You said we were too much. You said we had to figure it out ourselves. Harold stepped closer to her, placing a steady hand on her back. Hank watched quietly, standing just far enough away to let the family face what had been avoided for years. Kevin ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his voice. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The house, the bills, the responsibility. The house you sold, Harold interrupted. "The house I built with my own hands. The house you promised would take care of us." Kevin's eyes flicked toward Hank, then back to his father. "I was managing things, for you." "Managing?" Harold echoed bitterly. "You took everything and left us with nothing." Kevin's face hardened. "That's not how it happened." Hank finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "I saw them on that bench," he said. 6 hours in the cold. No food, no heat, no ride coming. Kevin turned sharply. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," Hank replied. "Because when someone abandons their parents, it stops being private." Kevin scoffed. "You bikers think you're heroes now?" Hank didn't flinch. "No, but I know what neglect looks like." Dorothy swayed slightly. Harold caught her just in time, easing her back onto the couch. That small moment changed everything. Kevin watched it happen. His mother weakened, his father exhausted, and something uncomfortable crossed his face. "You should have called me," Kevin muttered. "We did," Harold said quietly. "You hung up." The words landed hard. Kevin opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked towards the door, calculating, then back at his parents. "Fine," he said sharply. "If you won't come willingly, we'll let the authorities decide." Harold straightened. "I already decided." Hank stepped closer, not threatening, just present. "You can call whoever you want," he said, "but the truth won't change." Kevin stared at him, then at his parents. For the first time, he seemed to realize he wasn't in control anymore. His voice dropped. "You're choosing him over your own son?" Harold answered without hesitation. "I'm choosing dignity." Dorothy looked up at Kevin, tears filling her eyes. "I waited for you," she whispered. "I kept believing." Kevin's expression faltered, but only briefly. Pride rose faster than regret. "I can't fix this right now," he said, "but don't expect me to clean up the mess you're making." He turned toward the door. Before he could leave, Harold spoke again. "One more thing." Kevin paused. "If you ever come back," Harold said steadily, "it won't be to control us. It will be to apologize." Kevin didn't respond. He opened the door and stepped into the falling snow, slamming it shut behind him. The house felt warmer after he left. Dorothy let out a shaky breath and leaned against Harold. "Did we do the right thing?" Harold kissed her forehead. "Yes, even if it hurts." Hank watched them, something shifting deep inside him. He had stepped in to help for one night, but now he understood this was bigger than that. "I'll make some calls today," Hank said. "Social services, legal aid. There are options." Harold nodded slowly. "We've never asked for help before." "There's a first time for everything," Hank replied. Dorothy reached out and squeezed Hank's hand. "You didn't just save us from the cold," she said. "You reminded us we still matter." Hank swallowed, emotion tightening his throat. "You always did." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the small house, something fragile and powerful had taken root. Truth. And once spoken, it could no longer be buried. The house stayed quiet for a long time after Kevin left. Snow drifted past the windows, soft and steady, as if nothing significant had happened. But inside, everything had changed. Harold sat beside Dorothy, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. She leaned into him, exhausted, her earlier strength giving way to the weight of what had just unfolded. Hank stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the street. He didn't trust sudden exits. Men like Kevin rarely accepted loss without trying to regain control in another way. "Are you okay?" Hank finally asked, turning back to them. Dorothy nodded slowly. "I think so. I just didn't know saying the truth would hurt this much." Harold sighed. It hurts because we've been avoiding it for years. Hank didn't interrupt. This was their moment. Instead, he moved to the kitchen and began making breakfast. Simple eggs, toast, and coffee. Normal sounds filled the house. A small act, but grounding. As they ate, Harold spoke again. Kevin won't stop. Not after this. Hank nodded. I know. What will he do? Dorothy asked. He'll try to change the story, Hank replied. People like him always do. He was right. Less than 2 hours later, Hank's phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. And again. He looked down at the screen and frowned. What is it? Harold asked. Hank turned the phone so they could see. A social media post, already shared dozens of times, filled the screen. Someone had posted a photo of the elderly couple at the bus stop. The caption read, "These poor seniors were found abandoned on Christmas Eve. According to their son, they wandered off and were taken in by a biker who refuses to return them." Dorothy gasped. Wandered off? Harold's face went pale. He's lying. Hank scrolled. Comments poured in by the second. This is kidnapping. Call the police. Those bikers are dangerous. Someone save these poor parents. Kevin hadn't stayed quiet. He'd gone public. He's trying to turn people against you, Harold said to Hank. Against us. Hank set the phone down. Let him talk. Dorothy looked frightened. But what if people believe him? Then we tell the truth, Hank said calmly. Louder. By noon, the story had spread beyond one post. Local pages picked it up. A short clip from a security camera at the bus station surfaced, showing Harold and Dorothy sitting on the bench for hours. Alone, shivering. The comments shifted. Why didn't the sun come? Why were they there so long? They don't look confused. They look abandoned. Hank received a call from an unfamiliar number. This is Adult Protective Services, a woman said. We've received multiple reports. We need to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. Harold closed his eyes and exhaled. So it begins. The visit happened that afternoon. 2 caseworkers arrived, professional, calm, observant. They spoke with Dorothy gently, asking questions in simple language. They asked Harold to explain, step by step, what had happened. No rushing, no pressure, just listening. Hank stayed nearby, saying little. When the caseworkers left, one of them paused at the door. You did the right thing bringing them inside, she said quietly to Hank. Most people wouldn't. That night, the house felt different again, not peaceful but alert. The phone kept ringing. Messages flooded in. Some hateful, some supportive, some from strangers offering help. Dorothy read one message aloud with shaking hands. They say, people are praying for us. Harold smiled faintly. Imagine that. Hank sat back in his chair, exhausted. He hadn't asked for attention. He hadn't wanted a fight. But the truth had a way of surfacing once light touched it. Outside, a car slowed near the house, then drove on. Hank watched until it disappeared. This isn't over, he said quietly. No, Harold agreed. But for the first time, we're not alone. And somewhere beyond the falling snow, a private family betrayal had become a public reckoning. The next storm wasn't made of ice. It was made of truth. By the next morning, the story had grown bigger than any of them imagined. What began as a single post had turned into dozens of articles, shared videos, and heated comment threads. People weren't just reacting anymore. They were investigating. Someone had pulled public records. Someone else had posted screenshots. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge that Kevin Whitmore could no longer control. Hank sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through updates on his phone. He didn't like social media. Never had. But now it had become a weapon. One Kevin had tried to use, and one that was suddenly turning against him. Harold? Hank said, looking up. They found the house sale. Harold froze. What do you mean? Found it. The deed, the transfer, 3 months ago. Sold under Kevin's name as power of attorney. Dorothy sat quietly nearby, holding a warm mug in both hands. She didn't fully understand everything, but she understood enough to feel the shift in the room. Is that bad? She asked softly. It's not just bad, Harold replied slowly. It's proof. Throughout the day, calls came in. Reporters, advocacy groups, even a local church offering temporary housing and legal help. Hank declined interviews, but accepted contact information. This wasn't about fame. It was about protection. That afternoon, Adult Protective Services returned, this time with a legal representative. They spoke privately with Harold, explaining his rights. They explained conservatorship laws, financial abuse statutes, and emergency protection orders. For the record, the lawyer said gently, you did not abandon your home. Your home was taken from you. Harold closed his eyes, emotion washing over him. For the first time since the bus station, someone had said it out loud, clearly, officially. Kevin, meanwhile, was unraveling. His response video appeared online that evening. He stood in a clean office, wearing a calm expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. My parents are vulnerable, Kevin said to the camera. They were manipulated by a dangerous stranger. I was trying to protect them. The comments were brutal. Then why didn't you pick them up? Why were they at a bus station for 6 hours? Why did you sell their house? Kevin deleted the video within an hour. It was reposted everywhere. Hank watched it once, then shut off his phone. He still thinks control will save him, Hank said quietly. Dorothy looked up at Harold. Did we raise him wrong? Harold took her hand. We raised him with love. What he did with it, that was his choice. That night, a knock came at the door. Hank stiffened, but this time it wasn't Kevin. It was a woman in her 40s, wearing a heavy coat and holding a folder. My name is Laura, she said. I work with an elder advocacy group. We've been following your case. She stepped inside, respectful and calm, and laid out options: emergency housing, legal representation, protection orders. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a blank wall. You won't have to go back to him, Laura said firmly, and you won't have to face this alone. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. I was so afraid we'd end up back on that bench. You won't, Hank said, not happening. Late that night, Hank stepped outside onto the porch. Snow had stopped falling. The sky was clear and sharp, stars bright against the dark. His phone buzzed one last time. A text from an unknown number. You think you won? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Hank stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. Inside the house, Harold and Dorothy slept peacefully for the first time in days. Not because everything was solved, but because the truth was no longer buried. Kevin had tried to bury them quietly. Instead, he'd buried himself. And tomorrow, the final reckoning would begin. The courthouse steps were slick with melting snow when they arrived. Hank parked across the street and cut the engine. For a moment, none of them moved. Harold sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the stone building ahead. Dorothy sat in the back, bundled in her coat, her eyes moving slowly as if she were trying to anchor herself in the present. This is where it gets real, Harold said quietly. Hank nodded. It's already real. This just makes it official. They entered through the side doors, escorted by a legal aide from the elder advocacy group. The hallway smelled of old paper and disinfectant. Voices echoed softly, and every footstep felt louder than it should have. Kevin was already there, He stood near a row of benches, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, speaking urgently into his phone. When he saw them, his expression shifted. Surprise first, then irritation, then something colder. "So you actually showed up," he said, forcing a smile. "I was hoping you'd come to your senses." Dorothy shrank slightly, but Harold stepped forward. "We are in our senses." Kevin's gaze flicked to Hank. "And you're still involved." Hank said nothing. He didn't need to. Inside the courtroom, the air was tense but controlled. The judge listened as the caseworker outlined the timeline. Bus tickets, the hours at the station, the freezing temperatures, the sale of the house, the missing funds. Kevin's attorney tried to interrupt, but the judge raised a hand. "Let her finish." When it was Kevin's turn, he stood confidently. "My parents are confused. My mother has memory issues. I was trying to manage an impossible situation." Harold's attorney rose. "May my client speak?" The judge nodded. Harold stood slowly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I am 83 years old. I built my home with my hands. I trusted my son with everything I had. He sold my house, he kept the money, and he left my wife and me at a bus station on Christmas Eve." Dorothy looked up, her moment of clarity sharp and present. "I remember waiting," she said softly. "I remember being cold. I remember thinking my son would come." Kevin shifted uncomfortably. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Whitmore, do you deny leaving them at the station?" Kevin hesitated. "Just long enough." "No," he said finally. "But I never meant—" "That's enough," the judge interrupted. By afternoon, the ruling was clear. An emergency protective order was issued. Kevin was barred from controlling his parents' finances or housing. The sale of the house was flagged for investigation. Adult Protective Services was granted oversight. Kevin stormed out before the final words were spoken. Outside, reporters waited. Hank shielded Dorothy as cameras flashed. "Any comment?" someone shouted. Harold stopped and turned. "Yes," he said calmly. "Take care of your parents. One day you'll be old too." That evening, back at the house, the tension finally broke. Dorothy sat on the couch, holding a photograph of her wedding day that Hank had found in one of the suitcases. "I thought we were invisible," she whispered. "I thought no one would care." Hank shook his head. "You were never invisible. Someone just tried to make you feel that way." Harold looked at Hank, his voice thick. "You stood when everyone else walked by." Hank shrugged slightly. "Someone once did the same for me." The phone rang one last time that night. It was the advocacy lawyer. "Kevin's accounts are frozen. The investigation will continue." Hank hung up and exhaled. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Soft, quiet, harmless now. Tomorrow there would still be paperwork, therapy, healing. But tonight, justice had spoken, and Kevin's mask was finally gone. The house felt different that night, not quieter, warmer. Harold sat at the small dining table, carefully folding papers the lawyer had left behind. For the first time in weeks, the documents didn't feel like threats. They felt like protection. Dorothy rested on the couch nearby, humming softly, her fingers tracing the edge of an old photograph. Her and Harold on their wedding day, young and smiling, before life became complicated. Hank stood in the doorway watching them. "You don't have to stay," Harold said gently, looking up. "You've already done more than anyone ever should." Hank shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere tonight." Dorothy smiled at that. "Good," she said, "because I made soup again, and I don't think I could eat it alone." They laughed, quietly, carefully, but it was real. Laughter that didn't come from relief alone, but from survival. Later, as the evening deepened, Snow fell again outside the windows. Christmas lights from neighboring houses reflected softly against the glass. The world had moved on from headlines and outrage, but inside this house, something far more important was happening. Healing. Dorothy looked up suddenly, her eyes clear in one of her rare moments of perfect awareness. "Hank," she said, "you were supposed to pass us by." He met her gaze. "I know. But you didn't." "No." She nodded slowly. "That changed everything." Harold set the papers aside and stood. He walked toward Hank with effort, then stopped, emotion thick in his throat. "My son may have forgotten what family means," he said, "but you reminded us." Hank looked away. Praise was harder to accept than danger. "I didn't save you," he said quietly. "You saved yourselves. I just stopped long enough to let it happen." Outside, church bells rang in the distance, midnight approaching. Christmas had arrived. Dorothy reached for Harold's hand. "We didn't end up on that bench," she whispered. "That's the miracle." The next morning came slowly, no rushing, no fear, just sunlight on snow and the smell of coffee in the air. Arrangements were already in motion. Temporary housing through the advocacy group, financial recovery, counseling, medical care. A long road lay ahead, but it was a road with direction now. Before Hank left, Harold pressed something into his hand, a small wooden carving. Rough, hand-shaped. "I made it years ago," Harold said, "when Kevin was little. He never wanted it." Hank stared at it, speechless. "Keep it," Dorothy said softly. "So you remember us." Hank closed his fingers around it. "I won't forget." As he stepped outside, the cold hit his face. But it didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt honest. Clean. Behind him, through the window, Harold and Dorothy stood together. Still fragile, still wounded, but no longer abandoned. Hank mounted his bike, the engine rumbling to life. This time when he rode away, he knew something had followed him. Not guilt, not anger, purpose. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do isn't fixing everything. It's stopping when everyone else keeps walking. And on one frozen Christmas Eve, that choice changed 3 lives forever. If you see someone alone, struggling, abandoned, don't assume someone else will help. Sometimes you are the someone. If this story moved you, share it to remind others that kindness still matters. Speak up for the elderly and vulnerable. And remember, one decision can change a life, because compassion is still the most powerful thing we have.